Hello everyone. Today, we're diving into a fascinating journey through history, the Turkic migrations, a major movement that shaped much of Eurasia from the 4th to the 11th centuries. Imagine this: in the 6th century, the Oghuz Turks, a powerful Turkic tribe, toppled the Uyghur Khaganate in what's now Mongolia. From there, they spread out in all directions, bringing Turkic culture to the vast Eurasian steppes. Though the Oghuz Turks eventually faded away by the 8th century, they left behind a legacy that continued with other Turkic empires like the Uyghur Khaganate, the Khazars, and the Cumans. Some of these Turkic peoples settled down and built their own societies, such as the Kocho and Ganjo Uyghurs. By the 11th century, the Seljuk dynasty had made its way to Anatolia, and that's when the Turkic presence in that region became permanent. Today, Turkic heritage is still very much alive. Countries like Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan have large Turkic populations, and you can find Turkic communities in places like Russia, northern Cyprus, and even China. But where did the Turkic people really come from? There's a lot of debate about their origins. Some say the homeland of the Turkic peoples could be anywhere from the Trans-Caspian steppe to northeastern Asia. Others, like researcher Peter Benjamin Golden, believe that their roots might lie in the Shian-Altai region, which stretches across parts of South Siberia and Mongolia. Genetic studies also point to this region as the inner Asian homeland of the Turkic people. What's intriguing is that scholars believe the spread of Turkic culture across Eurasia wasn't just about a single, massive migration. Instead, it was more of a diffusion of language and culture, with various groups mixing and merging over time. Now, let's talk about the Huns, who are often linked with Turkic origins. The Huns first appeared as a nomadic people in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe between the 4th and 6th centuries. They were known as fierce warriors and horse riders, and their arrival in Europe shook things up, leading to the incorporation of various other groups like the Alans, Slavs, and Goths into their ranks. One of the mysteries surrounding the Huns is their origins. Some historians suggest a connection with the Xiongnu, another nomadic group from Inner Asia. But because the Huns left behind very few written records, their exact origins remain a bit of a puzzle. What we do know is that some of their personal names have Turkic elements, hinting at possible Turkic roots, while others show influences from Iranian, Germanic, or even unknown origins. And now let's focusing on some key players in this vast movement across Eurasia. So, around the 5th to 8th centuries, we see the Oghuz Turk wave sweeping across the steppes. The earliest mentions of Turks in historical texts are about groups like the Tile, who might have called themselves Tegreg, meaning people of the carts. These groups were noted by Chinese records, and some scholars believe that various names like Dili, and Dingling used in Chinese sources might all point to the same Turkic word, Tork. By the 6th century, we find the first references to the word Tork or Torkut in Chinese sources, noted as Tuju. This period also brings us the earliest evidence of the Turkic language, most notably from the Orhon inscriptions, left by the Oghuz Turks, also known as the Celestial Turks. But here's the thing: while some Turkic groups adopted the name Turk, others kept their own identities. The name Turk didn't apply to all Turkic peoples at the time, it mainly referred to those under the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. Meanwhile, other groups like the Tile and the Western Turkic Khaganate maintained their distinct tribal names. The Oghuz Turks, led by the Ashina clan, were originally famed metalsmiths. In the year 439, they moved from Pingyang, which is now part of modern-day China, to join the Rouran Confederacy. They got their name, Turk, from a mountain quarry that looked like a helmet, a fitting name for a warrior people. But in 546, when the Ashina leader, Yumin, helped the Rouran crush a Tile revolt, things took a turn. After being denied a Rouran princess as a reward, Yumin declared independence and established himself as Khagan in 551. His sons continued his legacy, eventually defeating the Rouran and expanding their territory to the edges of the Byzantine Empire by 568. However, after the death of Taspar Khagan in 581, the Oghuz Turk Empire split into two factions, leading to civil war. The Eastern Khaganate eventually fell to the Tang dynasty, while the Western Khaganate met a similar fate. But in 682, Ilturish Khagan rose up against the Tang and founded the Second Turkic Khaganate, though it too eventually fell to the Uyghurs in 744. Meanwhile, let's talk about the Bulgars, another significant Turkic group. By the 5th century, they had settled in the Black Sea Kuban steppe zone and were first mentioned in 480 as allies of the Byzantine Empire. Under their leader, Kubrat, the Bulgars revolted against the Avars and established what became known as Old Great Bulgaria. After Kubrat's death in the 660s, his territory was divided among his sons, leading to the creation of different Bulgar states, including the Volga Bulgaria, established by his son Kotrag. Osperu, another of Kubrat's sons, founded the First Bulgarian Empire. In 680, he defeated the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IV and established Bulgaria as an independent state, a significant moment as it was the first time the Roman Empire recognized a new power in the Balkans. And then there are the Khazars. Their origins are a bit of a mystery, with some sources suggesting a connection to the Uyghurs or the Oghuz Turks. By the mid-7th century, the Khazars had established themselves in the North Caucasus and became a formidable force, often clashing with the Umayyads. And now let's explore the fascinating history of the Kyrgyz and other prominent groups in Central Asia. So, the Yenisei Kyrgyz, as described in the Book of Tang, were quite unique. They were known for their tall stature, red hair, pale faces, and green eyes, a striking appearance that set them apart from many other groups. Some Kyrgyz had black eyes, and according to legend, these individuals were descendants of a Han general named Li Ling. This connection was even claimed by the Kyrgyz Khagans themselves, who proudly traced their lineage back to this Chinese general. They were skilled in crafting weapons, which they provided to the Turks, and though they engaged in agriculture, they didn't cultivate fruit. Geographically, they lived west of Lake Baikal and east of the Karluks, strategically positioned but often caught in the power struggles of the region. Speaking of power struggles, the Kyrgyz were not content under the First Turkic Khaganate's dominance. They found themselves at odds with the Uyghur Khaganate as well, which cut them off from their trade with China. The Uyghurs monopolized this trade, forcing the Kyrgyz to seek new trading partners, including the Tibetans, Arabs, and Karluks. This led to a series of conflicts with the Uyghurs from 820 onwards. Finally, in 840, the Kyrgyz managed to dismantle the Uyghur Khaganate. However, despite this victory, the Kyrgyz didn't have a significant impact on the larger geopolitical scene. The Chinese, seeing no further reason to maintain relations after the Uyghurs' downfall, paid little attention to the Kyrgyz. The Kyrgyz themselves showed no desire to occupy the former Uyghur territories to the east. By 924, the Khitans had taken over Ochukan, the heartland of the old Uyghur Khaganate. Now, let's shift our focus to the Turgesh, another Turkic group. In 699, their leader Wushal established a Khaganate stretching from Chak to Bishbalik. The Turgesh fiercely resisted the Tang dynasty and their Turkic allies until 711, when the resurgent Second Turkic Khaganate crushed them in battle. Despite this setback, the Turgesh under Suluk managed to re-establish themselves in Zetisu. However, Suluk met a tragic end in 737, betrayed by one of his own subordinates after a defeat by the Umayyads. The Tang dynasty seized this opportunity to invade Turgesh territory, taking the city of Suyab. By the 760s, the Karluks had driven out the Turgesh, signaling the end of their dominance. The Karluks themselves were an intriguing people. They had migrated into the region of Tokaristan as early as the 7th century. In 744, they played a key role in the rise of the Uyghur Khaganate by helping to overthrow the Second Turkic Khaganate. However, conflicts with the Uyghurs forced them to move further west into Zetisu. By 766, the Karluks had ousted the Turgesh and captured Suyab, the capital of the Western Turkic Khaganate. Islam began to spread among the Karluks in the 9th century, and by the 10th century, they were described as a nearly civilized people who engaged in agriculture, herding, and hunting. Al-Masudi even considered them to be the most beautiful among the Turks, with their tall stature and noble appearance. By the 11th century, they had integrated a significant number of Sogdians, which influenced their language and culture. Together with the Chijils and Yagmas, they formed the Kara Khanid Khanate, though it's unclear whether the Karluks or Yagmas held the dominant position. Finally, we come to the Pechenegs, Their history is somewhat shrouded in mystery, but they were first mentioned in Chinese sources in the 7th century, possibly under the name Beiru. This name is believed to be associated with the Onagers and Alans, two other significant groups in the region. However, it's not until the 8th century that we get a clearer reference to the Pechenegs in a report by an Uyghur envoy, which records a conflict between the Pechenegs and the Hor, who were likely the Uyghurs or Oghuz Turks. The Pechenegs were a nomadic people possibly related to the Khangali. In the late 9th century, conflicts with the Khazars drove them into the Pontic steppes. During the 10th century, they had extensive interactions with the Byzantine Empire, which relied on them to help control neighboring tribes. Both Byzantine and Muslim sources confirm that the Pechenegs had leaders, though the position wasn't hereditary. By the 11th century, the Pechenegs found themselves in conflict with the Rus and later with the Oghuz Turks, which eventually pushed them further west across the Danube into Byzantine territory. And the Oghuz Turks, whose name is derived from the Turkic words for clan or tribe, are a significant part of Turkic history. The term Oghuz was commonly used to describe various Turkic tribes, leading to some confusion over the years. For instance, you had the Turks Oghuz, or 9 tribes, the Sikirs Oghuz, meaning 8 tribes, and the Uch Oghuz, or 3 tribes. Despite these names, the Oghuz Turks were not necessarily a single unified group. Their leader was referred to as the Turks Khagan, even though there were more than 9 tribes under this title. The origins of the Oghuz Turks remain somewhat unclear. While they might have once been under the leadership of the Turks Oghuz, by the 11th century, they had become linguistically distinct from other groups like the Kipchaks and Karakanids. Some scholars connect the Oghuz with a Western Turkic tribe mentioned in Chinese sources, known as Gusu. However, the exact relationships among these tribes are still debated. The westward migration of the Oghuz began after the fall of the Second Turkic Khaganate and the rise of the Uyghur Khaganate in 744. Under Uyghur rule, the Oghuz leader held the title of Right Yarb, a term that later appeared in Muslim sources. The Oghuz engaged in numerous conflicts as they moved westward, battling the Pechenegs, Holoj, Karluk, and Khazars for control of the steppes. Despite the constant warfare, the Oghuz emerged victorious, establishing what became known as the Oghuz Yarb state. Throughout the 10th century, the Oghuz maintained a complicated relationship with their neighbors. They were often in conflict with the Pechenegs and Khazars, yet there were instances of cooperation. For example, the Khazars once hired the Oghuz to fend off an attack by the Alans. The Oghuz also allied with the Rus in 965 to attack the Khazars and again in 985 to raid Volga Bulgaria. The Oghuz Yarb state was decentralized, with no evidence of a single leader representing all the Oghuz people. By this time, some Oghuz tribes had settled in towns and converted to Islam, though many still adhered to Tengrism. Now, turning our attention to the Kimek-Kipchak confederation, the origins of the Cumans and Kipchaks are somewhat murky. They were likely distinct Turkic peoples who eventually joined forces, with the Cumans forming the western part of the confederation and the Kipchaks the eastern. The name Kipchak is said to derive from a Turkic word meaning hollow rotted-out tree, while Cuman might come from the word kun, meaning pale or yellow, likely referencing their lighter hair. These groups appear in historical records at different times, with the Kipchaks possibly mentioned as early as the 8th century in inscriptions. However, it wasn't until the 9th century that they were definitively recorded, living near the Turks Oghuz. As they migrated westward, they were pushed out by other forces like the Khitans, a people possibly related to the Mongols. This migration led them to clash with other tribes and eventually to settle in the northern steppes. In the mid-9th century, the Kimek-Kipchak confederation emerged in the northern steppes, stretching from Lake Balkhash in the east to the Aral Sea in the west. This confederation consisted of 7 minor tribes, including the Yemuks, Ima, Tatars, Bayanja, Kipchaks, Lanakas, and Ilad. The leader of this confederation initially held the title of Shad Tutuk, a military title borrowed from the Chinese. However, after remnants of the Uyghur Khaganate sought refuge among them in 840, they adopted the title of Yarb instead. By the early 10th century, the Kimks bordered the Oghuz to the south, with the Ural River marking their boundary. The Kimks were among the most isolated of the Turkic groups, far removed from the more sedentary civilizations to the south. They had only one town within their territory, and by the 11th century, they were displaced by the Cumans, another Turkic people. As time went on, the various Turkic groups, including the Khazars, Turkmens, Uyghurs, and Kyrgyz, continued to evolve and spread throughout Central Asia and beyond. Many of these groups came into contact with Muslims and gradually adopted Islam, though other religions persisted among them, such as Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism. The Turkmens, in particular, formed a significant part of the Islamic world. Their identity as Turkmens likely emerged later, during the Islamic era, after the fall of the Oghuz Turk Khanates. The term Turkmen is thought to mean most Turkish of the Turks or pure-blooded Turks, reflecting a sense of ethnic pride among these tribes. By the 13th century, Turkic soldiers had risen to power in the Muslim Middle East, particularly under the Abbasid caliphs. The Oghuz and other Turkic tribes, under the leadership of the Seljuk dynasty, captured and dominated various regions, including parts of the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid territories. Meanwhile, other Turkic groups like the Kyrgyz and Uyghurs continued to struggle against one another and the Chinese Empire. The Kyrgyz eventually settled in the area now known as Kyrgyzstan, while the Batu hordes, following the Mongol invasion, conquered the Volga Bulgars and Kipchaks, reshaping the landscape of Central Asia and Russia. In Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks established themselves as a dominant force, granting fiefdoms to various Turkmen tribes. These Turkmen, particularly those who passed through the Caucasus into Azerbaijan, became the ancestors of the modern Turkish nation and the Azerbaijani people. The legacy of these Turkic tribes continues to influence the cultural and political landscape of the region to this day.